the whole point of this part of the Catechism is to speak about the morality of human action. And so we want to speak about the morality and what is human action, right? Human action is action that is done. We might say, man is the master of his actions, whether they are good or whether they are evil. And so the first quality of a human action is that it's one where we are the master of it. Right? And that's a lot of times when people who have serious deficiencies or who have fallen into addiction, one thing that's problematic for them is that they don't have domain over their own actions anymore. Right? So a lot of times what we're doing when we're trying to help people overcome really bad situations is that we're trying to help them get them back to the point where they have dominion over their own actions, where they can actually say, I am a free actor. And so the title under which we discuss this part is freedom, human freedom. And the Catechism says this: God creates man as a rational being, giving him the dignity of a person who can initiate and control his own actions. Man is left in his own counsel to seek his Creator, to attain the happiness that he's meant to attain. So then this quoting one of the fathers of the church, St. Irenaeus, but again, this is very, human reason can arrive at this, right? Man is rational, and because he's rational, he's like God. He's created with a free will and master of his actions. So, what do we mean then by free will? I think one of the problems of freedom, or one of the difficulties of talking about freedom with somebody, is that there are two understandings of freedom. And when you're a parent, obviously part of the great challenge of being a parent, which God calls us to, most of us to, is how do you help a child go from being completely dependent upon you as the parent to being master of his actions, right? That's the whole transition. And it's a simple image, but I think an image that could be helpful is if you think of the places or there are some cars that are still stick shift, right? Where you have the clutch and the gas, right? And obviously the whole challenge of driving a stick shift is that as you release the clutch, you press down on the gas. And if you release the clutch too quickly, the car stalls. Right? If you press down on the gas too quickly, you just hear a high revving engine, right? But it doesn't really go anywhere. Right? So that's the whole challenge of being a parent, is helping a child become master of his actions. And in our day and age, it's really complicated. It's more complicated, let's say, than 100 years ago, just because 100 years ago, you could kind of assume that a parent could kind of assume that everyone in my neighborhood, even the local public school, the private schools, other institutions that might be around there, right? They were all kind of helping me in this task. In our day and age, you can't assume anything, right? Now, it's always the case that parents are responsible for the upbringing of their children, right? That's always the case of this dynamic that we're speaking about. But there's just, our circumstances are such that with kind of Christian culture fading in many places, and a kind of virulent, whatever you want to call it, paganism, secularism, virulent something taking its place, it complicates that process. And it's important that parents be aware of this, because some of the techniques that we're normal and acceptable 100 years ago are no longer work. And so it's not that those techniques are bad, but it's just that we're in a new set of circumstances. So that means some things are going to have to be a little bit different. So the first understanding of freedom is this. It's the power to do A or B, right? Or A, B, or C, right? It's the power to choose between different possibilities and to choose deliberately with one's own responsibility. And this is the basic understanding of freedom that I think most people appreciate and can understand on some level. That with a certain amount of maturity, I can be an independent person and I can choose to do A, B, or C. I can choose to go towards God or not. I can choose to do this or that. And there's another, I think that's the easy understanding of freedom. Many people value that understanding of freedom. I think we can have little debates about, well, again, these are like side debates, but some people might have more choices than others, right? Some people might have choice A, B, C, or D. And other people might just in a given moment of life, they might just have A or B, or a limited number of choices. That doesn't mean they're not overall free. Right? Obviously, there could be some extreme cases where that's the case, and you want to try to change those circumstances. But I know this one guy. He said he loves his father, and he's very happy for his dad at this point, because he said when I was growing up, whenever I was on the verge of complaining about something, my dad would ask me two questions. He would say, "Do you have?" He would ask actually three questions. My dad would ask me three questions. Do you have food on the table? Yes. Do you have clothes on your back? Yes. Do you have a roof over your head? Yes. Good. You got nothing to complain about, right? Everything else is like icing on the cake, right? You got nothing to complain about. You're free, right? And there is something to that. But that also may be the advice of a father, right? That also may be the good advice of a father. But there's another notion of freedom, which is the possibility of choosing between good and evil, which is a kind of freedom, right? The possibility of sinning or of growing in perfection. And so this first notion of freedom is kind of connected with the second notion of freedom, right? Because we can positively choose between good and evil. But in the second notion of freedom, we only really become free if we choose the good. So Adam and Eve, before original sin, they're free in this second notion of freedom. They're intellectually aware of evil, right? They know it as a possibility. But they don't experience it as a material thing, as a physical thing. They're still free to choose it. And they still intellectually know of it as a possibility. But it does. So there's the danger, and this is how the devil tricks Adam and Eve. He gets them to think the only way you can be free is if you choose evil. And if you have a real physical experience of evil, that's the only way you can really be free. That's how you'll be like God. And that's kind of the tragedy of their choice of evil. So the second notion of freedom is that the more good we do, the freer we become. We're only really free, and part of this has to do with an understanding of, look, part of the goal of human life after original sin, and even after baptism, it's still left to us, is how do we bring all of our desires, our emotions, and all the faculties of our intellect, our will, our imagination, our memory, our passions, our senses, right? How do we bring all of that and harmonize all of that so that the body and the soul are united. The body and the mind are united with the soul, and the whole person is united doing what is good in the service of God and others. Right? So how do you bring about that harmony? I think maybe even freedom, I don't know, sometimes I think just to change words a little bit can help, but how do you harmonize everything? I think harmony is a better word maybe than order. How do you order everything? People get nervous about order. You can say, how do you order everything properly? But how do you harmonize everything properly? How do you harmonize? And this is a big field. This is a big topic right now in neuroscience. Like the brain and the body, the way that they approach it is they say the brain and the body is made up of many parts. Well, if one, and even the scientists will say this, if one part takes over and it makes the mind and the body serve that part, well, that's not healthy for the person. Right? So the goal of good psychology, good psychiatry is how do we harmonize all of these parts according to the highest or the best thing in us? There's this scientist, historian, who's written a book called The Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist. If you need a reason, if you need something to help you fall asleep at night, I recommend this book, right? If you have amnesia, this will help you recover from amnesia. This book is like 600, it's like this thick. And the whole point of it is to say that it's like a compilation of all this scientific evidence that the intellect in the human person is like the master. And then all the desires, all the emotions, all the other faculties are like the emissaries. And in the healthy person, the intellect is the master and all the other parts are emissaries. And they're obeying the master and carrying out the master wants. In almost everything that becomes defective, some part takes over and makes the reason its servant. And that never leads to a good result, right? That always ends up. But I just say that like FYI, just so you know stuff like that's out there, right? I think sometimes people come and they'll say, I have this problem, I have that problem, I have this other problem. How do you prove this about morality, that about morality? It can be a good technique to say, I don't know, but I know there's an answer out there. Let's find out. I was watching this video. Someone sent me a video a few weeks ago of this quarterback, this wide receiver. He was on some show and he was talking about his relationships with his quarterback. And he said, when I first sat down with the quarterback, the first thing he asked me was, he said something like, what do you think about X topic? It was like a controversial topic. What do you think about X topic? And that was like the first thing he said to me. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know much about that. And he said to me, well, you go read something about that and come back to me and we can talk about it, right? And I did. I went out and I read something about it. I came back and I talked to him about it. And we actually had this great conversation. And he started doing this with me in many things. Go read about it and we can talk about it. And so some students will come to me here, like in Boston, and they'll say, what about, we were in this argument about God's existence or the nature of morality, and what do you have to say about that? And the first thing I'd like to say about it is, well, do you know that there are professors at Harvard and Boston University and Boston College who have spent their whole lives studying these questions? And so even if you can beat me up in an intellectual conversation, like I can't give you the answer, right? Maybe before that you and your roommates argue about this, maybe you should talk with one of these professors, right? Or buy one of his books and read it, right? In other words, go find out what somebody has said about this, somebody who knows something, somebody who's trustworthy, before you kind of reject everything because I can't refute your little argument, or you don't accept my little argument, or whatever, right? And that can be an approach that I think parents can, especially as children are getting to be adolescents and whatnot, even it's not bad to say, well, I don't know everything in the world. I don't know everything about this. Let's study it. Let's find out. Let's see what's said about this out there. And let's figure this out together. That can be a very helpful approach. And then obviously being, trying to at least say, well, part of being fair is you got to find out the two sides. So what's one side and what's the other side? Before you just come to a conclusion based on following one position. And actually I think that's one way by which children start to make things their own, right? But parents, teachers are still very much guiding them, helping them say, okay, what's valuable out there? What's worth considering? What's trustworthy? As opposed to just one side, let's say, to an issue. But what I'm saying here, what I want to say about freedom is that the better our intellect operates, the freer we are, right? If you can make here analogies with the body, right? Athletes who become very good at what they do, the ice skaters, ballerinas, right? What's one of the features of a good athlete or a good performer is that when they're doing what they do, you almost say it seems so easy for them. It seems like there's no effort. Like their muscles just do exactly what they want them to do without effort, seemingly. That's a good example of virtue, right? The organ, the muscle, it's doing what it should do with ease, as a habit. I have this physical therapist who's, again, he's just raw man. He's a raw man, right? I don't know how to say it, but he's he says, look, what I have to do is that he actually used the word habit. He said, you have these passive habits, and they're really bad for your muscles, right? And they make you ache in this way and that way and this other way. So what we have to do is we have to retrain your muscles to get rid of these passive habits. And so I said to him, no, so I said, I can take you one step further. I know your physical therapy better than you do, right? That what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get me to acquire active habits. You're trying to get my muscles to become virtuous, right? to act with ease. And what do we have to do? We have to train, right? We have to habitually exercise to get rid of those bad passive habits, those imperfections or whatever imbalances, and we have to retrain the muscles to act properly, so that we have active habits. And then he just finished the sentence for me. He said, we do them with ease. I said, exactly. Then you take what you do with muscles and you apply it to your intellect, your will, your passions, how the different passions interact with the intelligence, with the imagination, with the memory, with the intellect, with the will. You start to understand all those internal relationships to the person, and then how the person reacts in the face of other persons and circumstances. And he was like, well, that's way too much for me, man. I'm just going to stick with the muscles. But you can see that this is what the virtues are, right? It's how do all these relationships, how do they work properly? How do they function well? That's freedom, right? So freedom is when not just my muscles, but freedom is when my intellect, my will, my passions, my emotions, they all act with ease in the way that they should be acting, right? And so the more free we are, the more responsible we are, the more good we can do, the more we have mastery over all the different parts that make us up. You could also say the freer we are, really the more we're like God. So another feature of human action is that in a human action, the person is responsible for what he does. This is where we can say that people can do good or evil based on what they do, right? That there's a drama in every human action. So I knew this guy. I've told stories about him before, and so if I'm repeating a story you've heard before, I'm sorry. But sometimes people will say, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Like, we've heard the same stories 15 times," right? And I never want to fall into that, but I think this is a story worth meditating on, so we can tell it again. But there's this guy, he ran a company. It was an investment firm that made billions of dollars, right? He became a master of the universe type person. And he wanted to convert to Catholicism. And one of the reasons he wanted to convert is he said, when I was hiring employees and then I saw how employees behaved in my company, I realized there was a certain group of employees. It almost didn't matter what religion they were, but you just got the sense in talking with them that they thought that humans could only do evil. There's some notions there's some ideas of human nature out there and that line of, the Puritans were like that, right? You can only do evil. You can't do any good. Our beloved Puritans who founded Boston, they were that way. So, and this guy said, those people in my company that thought you could only do evil, they would do the worst things. Right? They would just do terrible things, cheating the company or trying to get away with bad stuff or whatnot. And then he said to me, and then there was another group of people that they came into the company and they thought that you can only do good things. And he said those people, they would do far worse things than the evil people, right? They would cheat and scam and whatnot in worse ways than the evil people. And then he said, I got to a point in my company where I realized I had all these Catholic employees, and their basic approach was, we should be doing good, and most of the time we will, but we got to be careful because we can do evil, right? And he said, those were my best employees, and they didn't do terrible things. They would sometimes do bad things and make mistakes, but they didn't do the worst things. And so that for that reason, he wanted to become Catholic, right? He wanted to be like his... But so this is part of, and this is also when some people will say, well, if someone's suffering from some addiction or some terrible condition, should you just let them be like that? Well, no, because they're not free, right? They're not responsible between doing good and evil. And oftentimes, when people are overtaken by a vice, they become slaves to the vice. Augustine says, a man has as many masters as he has vices. Right? That when you're a slave, when you're following a vice, a passion, a part of you, a desire, you're actually not free. You're not responsible. And you do evil. And that's why Saint Paul the Great says in Veritatis Splendor, it's incumbent upon us to keep forming ourselves, to keep discovering those places where we're not free, to free ourselves. That there's that great passage in Virgil where he's describing Neptune taking over the ships so they don't go to Rome. And he says Neptune releases the currents, which is like releasing the passions in the soul. And that the passions in the soul, they always present themselves as liberators. But when they rule in the soul, they rule with despotic tyranny, right? So when the parts or when the passions take over, they don't let go. And it can become very hard. That's why addiction is such a problem for many people, because the passion becomes deeply entrenched, and it becomes very hard to free the person from the control of the passion. But we want to become responsible. And the Catechism says responsibility, right? It can be nullified or diminished because of ignorance. If we're thinking about like a person going to confession, right? That if a person is ignorant, under duress, under fear, they make a mistake, a bad habit, inordinate attachments, other psychological and social factors, right? That can reduce the responsibility the person has for his actions. But still, everyone should want to know, like, what am I doing wrong? A great example of this is this couple. They were on the verge of divorce because the guy had anger issues. I mean, serious anger issues. And they were going to this one counselor, and the counselor basically said at some point, he said, look, we've been at this for like 10 years, and at this point, your anger is so bad and uncontrollable. I just think separation is what you should do. But he said, but we haven't, there's one thing we haven't done. We haven't like looked at anything like medical. So just go see this doctor. And so they go see the doctor. And the doctor just starts asking like all sorts of like workplace type questions to both people. And then eventually he says to the husband, like, where do you work? I work in a furniture factory. What do you do in the furniture factory? I'm the last guy on the line. I put the glue on the wood to, press the fabric onto it. What kind of glue is it? Is whatever he describes the glue. And the doctor looks up the glue. He looks up the chemicals in the glue. And then he discovers that one of the effects of the chemicals in the glue is that those chemicals, like they break whatever part of the brain it is that has dominion over anger. It doesn't destroy it, but it nullifies. It makes it kind of like dead, like a corpse, like it fall asleep. So this guy was inhaling this glue, and on this it doesn't have the same. It's a potential side effect, so not everybody can have. So this guy breathing this glue, it shut down the part of his brain where he could control his anger. And so he was always angry because he was just breathing this glue. So they move him to another part of the factory, and he goes back to his funny, joyful, youthful self, like who never got angry. And it saved the marriage, right? So obviously he's not as... There's a factor there where he was not as responsible for the anger. But obviously it's much better that he acquires responsibility over it. You don't want him to remain in that sad state, right? Now, in the case of moral action, actions that are directly willed, we are responsible for. Right? The Lord asked Eve after sinning in the garden, "What is this that you have done?" He asks Cain the same question. The prophet Nathan questions David after he commits adultery in the same way. Right? We are fully responsible for actions that we willfully choose. We can also be responsible for actions that we should have known, like the phrase, you should have known better, right? So if you're disobeying traffic laws, I'm just giving like simple examples just to understand the contours. If you disobey traffic laws and that leads you to hit somebody, well, you're still responsible, right? Because you should obey the traffic laws. There can be bad evils that we tolerate because we don't really will that evil effect, but there's some good that we're pursuing that we don't directly will, right? So a mother who's taking care of her sick child, she becomes exhausted. And because of her exhaustion, she can't get out of bed and go to Mass. Well, again, you tolerate that. You're not willing the not going to Mass, right? So that's not imputed to do. You're not responsible for that in a way. Because you don't will not going to Mass as an end or as a means. Obviously, sin causes problems with respect to our ultimate salvation and also with respect to our freedom. Sin darkens the mind, right? So sin prevents the intellect from seeing what is good. So sin prevents us from being fully responsible. Sin also weakens the will. And so it makes the will less capable of acting freely or acting responsibly. Sin also makes the passions stronger in the way that the person acts. So in those ways, sin limits freedom, especially that second notion of freedom. Sin also limits our capacity to choose between a number of alternatives. Right? The person who is an addict just has one, every problem in life has one choice, right? May really has one option. I'm going to go for the dopamine, the bad dopamine. Apparently now the neuroscientists are saying there's good dopamine and bad dopamine, right? Good dopamine is like a good conversation you have with a person. Actually, I was listening to this podcast. A cold shower provides for good dopamine. It's kind of funny. Some of the things that people will resort to in the search of good dopamine. And like actually bad dopamine is just glancing at the phone is a little dose of bad dopamine. And the problem with an addict, right? Obviously drugs, alcohol, that all leads to bad dopamine. Marijuana, bad dopamine. But the problem with an addict is that the addict can no longer get the good feeling that the first time he uses or he experiences the addiction. He can no longer get that good feeling anymore, so he becomes depressed. But he keeps trying the same thing. It's just he can never get to what he first thought he felt. So he's kind of a slave. I mean, a man has as many as masters as he has vices. So we always want to be hesitant. We always want to, like, some people will say, well, freedom is choosing A, B, C, or D. Therefore, true freedom must be having as many choices as possible. Well, no, that's also obviously freedom. Part of freedom is having a range of choices, but it's not having unlimited choices, right? It's also not freedom is also not determining for yourself what is good or bad, right? That's the law of sin. It's also, we want to avoid any kind of sense that grace is somehow opposed to freedom, that grace limits freedom. So the way to think about this is to think of like, well, gold is purified in fire. That's an image from the Bible. Right? Gold by itself has impurities in it. So how do they make that gold? How do they make that gold lose its impurities? They put it in a fire. So in this image, the gold in the fire is like the grace being applied to the soul. And so when you take it out of the fire, it's purer gold. It's better. It's even, and that's the proper image of grace. Grace doesn't limit what we can do. Grace enables us to exercise all of our faculties even better than before we had grace. Now, how do you evaluate moral actions? There's two final questions here. Number one is, how do we evaluate moral actions? And then what is the role of the passions in the moral life? I think evaluating moral actions, the principles are very simple. And this is the principle of all ethics. Personal ethics, politics, business ethics, medical ethics. These principles apply for all ethics. And once you know the principles, really the difficulty in ethics is just describing the circumstances so you can properly apply the principles. Right? So the difficulty of business ethics, medical ethics, any kind of ethics, is just how do you, and that's most of the classes in those fields or disciplines, it's just how do you describe the principle? How do you describe the circumstances? Like what's actually happening? So you can apply the principles. But it's and actually, a lot of medical ethics, I know, and business ethics, it's just giving people the confidence to live according to the principles. It's just, you don't have to go along with what everybody else is doing. So number one, there's three parts to every free human action. There's the object of the action. There's the object that's chosen, right? The object is the thing that you're doing. There's the intention. Why are you doing it? Right? What's your purpose? What's your reason for doing it? Why are you doing it? We call that the end or the intention. And then there are the circumstances surrounding the action. These are the three parts of every human action. And there's a simple rule. All three have to be good. It's like, so this is, it's not like baseball. In baseball, 3 strikes and you're out. In morality, one strike and you're out, right? All three parts of the human action have to be good in order for the action as a whole to be good. The object has to be good and it has to be in conformity with the true good. The intention also must be good. Our purpose, the end goal, the goal of the activity has to be directed towards our own good, the good of others, and ultimately towards the love of God. When you start to think these things through, obviously there can be many intentions perhaps involved in one action. There could be a layer of intentions. And in a good ethics class, people will go through these things. Any intention that is disordered is obviously evil, and a good intention cannot make a disordered object good. You can never lie. There could be moments, so like this is a great distinction both for lying. I think that once you get lying right, then it helps with a lot of other kinds of behavior. You can never say what's false. You can't say what's false, but you don't have to say everything, right? You don't have to say everything to the one who has the authority, who deserves to be told the thing, right? So you can never lie. You can't say what's false, but you don't have to say everything. There are ways in which you can be silent. The end never justifies the means. We can't condemn the innocent so that to save the nation, right? That's biblical. You can't condemn the innocent to save the nation or the political system or our power or our position or whatever. And also the circumstances. This part of the circumstances are also the consequences or the effects of the actions. The secondary, even the tertiary effects of the actions. They also have to be good. So there are people who say, well, my action was good, my intention was good, but the effects were terrible because you didn't account for the circumstances. So that's not good. Harvard people have great problems with this. I mean, Ivy League people in general, they're so smart. They know what's good. They know that their intention is good, but they don't think about the consequences of what they're doing. They lack wisdom. That's why sometimes simple people have more wisdom than very intellectual people. I can say that as an intellectual. Right? It's an occupational hazard. So for an action to be morally good, the end, the object, the intention, and the circumstances all must be good. It's erroneous to reduce a human action to any one of the three. And then the passions. The passions are all of our natural emotions and desires. Again, we could teach a whole class on the passions, right? And most passions, St. Thomas Aquinas says you can reduce the passions to 4 basic desires, right? Love or hope and joy, fear and sadness, right? Hope or love is the desire for some good to come your way or to avoid, or some evil to avoid some evil. Right? Joy is you receive that good or you avoid that evil. And then, fear is obviously you fear missing out on some good or you fear acquiring some evil. And then sadness is you miss out on the good or the evil thing comes to you. And Aquinas says you can start to derive all the emotions and desires from these 4. Right? And the basic point is that the passions in themselves are neither good nor evil. They're morally good or evil, whether they conform to the object, the intention, and the circumstances. Right? The objective norm of morality. And of course, someone can have very strong feelings, but these are not decisive in morality. What's decisive is how you act. It's what you do. This is very important with, I think, all the gender issues, right? In different levels, right? Everybody, because of original sin, I think the simplest way to go about this, I could be wrong, but I think if someone comes to you and they're like, oh, I don't know who I am or what this or that, right? I think one healthy approach is everybody, because of original sin, has, and it's different for everyone because everybody's different, right? We're all different. Everybody, because of original sin, has some feelings or emotions that are very strong. And they could lead you this way or that way. That's why we have the objective norms of morality. The objective norms of morality teach us how our actions, what we should do with our feelings or our passions or our emotions. Right? And everybody has some strong emotions or feelings or passions or whatever, or desires, that if they follow them and act on them, it's not gonna turn out well. Here the Catechism says, right, strong feelings that come from the imagination or the hormones or the whatever, right? There's an inexhaustible reservoir of images and affections that can come up in the moral life, right? It's endless, it's infinite, right? Anything can happen, anything is possible. But it all comes back to how do you act? And also, if you act well over time, and again, depending on how deep-seated these things are, whether they're from birth or environment, parents, upbringing, right? Over time, you can train your passions to act properly. It can take, some people can do it very quickly, other people it takes more time. But it can happen. And what matters ultimately is how we act, what we do. A lot of the spiritual life is struggle with. Thoughts arise. Affections arise. Where do they come from? Who knows? Who knows? They could come from the devil. They could come from your environment. They could come from your upbringing, a memory from your youth. I mean, there's all sorts of potential sources of our thoughts. And to some degree, our thoughts don't matter. Right? What matters is how we act. Like people will come to confession and they'll confess their thoughts. Well, just the presence of a thought is not necessarily a bad thing. It might be good to confess it because you're asking for grace in that struggle, and that's great. There's no problem with that, so long as you understand that that's what's going on, right? But what ultimately matters is not a thought that might emerge. What matters is, do we let it linger? Do we chew on it? Do we see maybe that thought is evil? And then do we delight in the evil? Now that's where like sin starts to come in, right? But in all those moments between when the thought emerges to here, there's all sorts of things we can do spiritually to transform that thought into a victory of grace, right? Into growth, into human and spiritual growth. So passions for us are really, there are a lot of the passions, the thoughts, the desires. That's our matter for growing as Christians. It's the matter that we have for growing as humans and for growing as Christians. That's why some of these ideologies that say, well, you have some thought, or you have some disposition, or you have some feeling, or you have some strong sensibility. That's why these ideologies that rationalize these and say you're fixed, you're this way, you always have to give in to this. That's why they're so insidious, humanly and supernaturally. Because they're basically saying there's some area of life where you don't have to grow. Right? You can just let that little child within you keep rattling the rattle, right? That's just not healthy. It's an anti-growth formula. Are there any questions?